Marcus Boone wiped the axle grease from his calloused hands, staring through the haze of Colorado dust. The afternoon stagecoach had finally lurched to a halt in front of the Silver Plume assay office. Marcus had sent away for a sturdy, thick-waisted widow who knew how to skin a buck and survive a winter at 10,000 heiress. Instead, the coach door swung open and the breath left his lungs. A woman stepped down wearing ruined emerald green silk, her skin like porcelain, her eyes wide with a desperate hunted terror. The rough-hewn townsfolk stopped dead in their tracks. Marcus gripped the edge of the boardwalk, his voice a gravelly whisper. "That can't be my bride." Marcus Boone was not a man built for the soft edges of civilization. For 12 years, he had carved his existence out of the granite and ice of the Colorado Rockies, living in a hand-hewn cabin clinging to the side of Gray's Peak. He was a trapper by trade, a miner when the gold fever occasionally struck him, but mostly he was a solitary creature. His beard was thick and shot with premature gray from winters that regularly dipped to 40 below. His eyes were the pale, washed-out blue of a high-altitude sky, but solitude, Marcus had found, had a way of turning into a slow, quiet madness. The previous winter, trapped by snowdrifts for 3 straight months, he had caught himself having full conversations with his lead mule, Samson. It was then he decided that a man wasn't meant to die without hearing another human voice. He didn't need love. He needed a partner, a survivor. He had placed an advertisement in the Matrimonial Times out of St. Louis. He'd been completely honest about the harshness of his life. 3 months later, a letter arrived from a Martha Higgins. She was 32, widowed by a farming accident, strong-boned, and entirely unbothered by the cold. She wrote practically, asking about the root cellar and the availability of flour. Marcus had liked her immediately. He sent her the stagecoach fare, along with a brief, unromantic proposal. Now, standing in the muddy, rutted street of Silver Plume on a biting November afternoon, Marcus felt a cold dread pooling in his gut. Josiah Miller, the local stage agent and part-time mayor, was already pulling the leather trunks from the top of the Concord coach. He paused, wiping his brow, and stared at the woman standing in the dust. She was entirely out of place, like an orchid dropped into a pile of gravel. Her dress, though stained at the hem with trail mud, was an intricate creation of emerald silk and black velvet. Her hair, a rich cascade of dark auburn, was coming undone from a complex arrangement of pins, but it was her face that held the town captive. She possessed a refined, striking beauty, with high cheekbones and a delicate jawline, yet she looked entirely exhausted, clutching a small leather valise to her chest, as if it were a shield. Marcus stepped off the wooden boardwalk, his heavy leather boots crunching on the frozen dirt. He approached the coach slowly, his towering frame casting a long shadow over her. "Ma'am," Marcus rumbled, his voice thick from disuse. He looked past her, into the dark interior of the coach. "Is there anyone else in there?" The woman flinched slightly at the depth of his voice. She looked up at him, her wide hazel eyes scanning his imposing figure, his broad shoulders draped in a canvas duster, the hunting knife strapped to his thigh, his weathered face. "No," she said, her voice a melodic, cultured alto that completely lacked the Midwestern twang he had expected. "I am the only passenger remaining." Marcus frowned, his thick brows knitting together. "I'm looking for a Martha Higgins. I sent her fare." The woman's grip on her valise tightened until her knuckles turned white. A flicker of panic passed through her eyes, quickly replaced by a desperate, forced resolve. She took a breath, straightening her slender shoulders. "I am the bride you sent for, Mr. Boone."
My bride.
The silence in the street was absolute. Josiah Miller dropped a trunk. It hit the dirt with a heavy thud, but no one looked away from the standoff between the giant mountain man and the society beauty. "You aren't Martha Higgins," Marcus said flatly. It wasn't a question. Martha is a 32-year-old farm widow from Missouri. You look like you've never held a pitchfork in your life, let alone butchered a hog. "Circumstances change," she said, her voice wavering slightly before she hardened it. "My name is Genevieve Higgins. Martha was my sister. She took ill of the cholera before she could make the journey." It was a lie. Marcus knew men, and he knew animals, and he knew when cornered prey was trying to bluff its way out of a trap. But there was something in her eyes, a deep, visceral terror that she was trying desperately to mask. She wasn't just lying, she was running. Josiah cleared his throat, stepping forward. "Well now, Marcus, the lady has the letters you sent. Showed them to me in Denver when she boarded my line. Legally speaking, she's got a right to the arrangement if she's the proxy." Genevieve reached into her valise with trembling fingers and produced the very letter Marcus had written 6 weeks ago, the handwriting undoubtedly his own. She held it out to him, her chin tipped up in defiance, though he could see the slight tremor in her hands. "Are you turning me away, Mr. Boone?" she asked softly. "Because if you are, I have nowhere else to go. The fare is spent." Marcus looked from the delicate woman to the darkening sky over the mountains. A winter storm was brewing. He could smell the ozone and snow in the wind. If he left her here, a woman looking like that in a rough mining camp full of lonely, desperate men, she wouldn't last the week. He didn't want a fragile porcelain doll. He didn't want a liar, but he couldn't leave her to the wolves. "Grab her trunk, Josiah," Marcus growled, turning on his heel. He didn't look back at her as he walked toward his waiting wagon. "Let's go, Genevieve. It's a 5-hour ride to the cabin, and the snow ain't waiting for us to get acquainted." The journey up the winding, treacherous switchbacks to Gray's Peak was an exercise in agonizing silence. Marcus drove the buckboard wagon, urging his 2 mules, Samson and Delilah, up the steep, rocky inclines. Beside him sat the woman calling herself Genevieve, shivering violently despite the heavy wool blankets Marcus had practically thrown at her before they departed the town. The temperature plummeted with every 100 ft of elevation. The emerald silk dress, which had looked so out of place in town, was utterly useless against the biting wind that whipped through the pines. Marcus watched her out of the corner of his eye. She didn't complain. She didn't whimper. She merely sat rigid, her teeth chattering so loudly he could hear them over the clatter of the wagon wheels. With a heavy sigh, Marcus pulled back on the reins and engaged the brake. He stood up, shrugging off his massive buffalo hide coat. "Put this on," he ordered, holding the heavy, pungent garment out to her. Genevieve looked at the coat, then at him. He was left in just a flannel shirt and a canvas vest, the freezing wind tearing at his clothes. "I cannot take your coat, Mr. Boone. You will freeze." "I've survived a decade up here, lady. You ain't going to survive the next 10 miles. Put it on before you freeze to death, and I have to dig a grave in frozen dirt." His bluntness made her blink, but she didn't argue further. She allowed him to drape the massive, heavy hide over her delicate shoulders. It swallowed her whole, smelling of wood smoke, pine pitch, and old leather. She pulled it tight around herself, burying her face in the thick fur collar. "Thank you," she murmured. "Don't thank me yet," Marcus replied, snapping the reins to get the mules moving again. "You haven't seen where we're going." As the wagon rattled on, Marcus's mind worked furiously. Genevieve Higgins. It sounded false, just thinking about it. Her hands, briefly exposed when she took the coat, were soft, uncalloused, with neatly manicured nails. The ring finger of her left hand bore a faint, pale indentation. The ghost of a ring recently and hastily removed. "So," Marcus began, his voice cutting through the howl of the wind, "Martha was your sister?" "Yes," Genevieve replied, her voice muffled by the fur collar. "And she died of cholera. It was very sudden." "Odd," Marcus noted casually, his eyes fixed on the treacherous trail ahead, "because cholera ain't exactly a winter disease in Missouri. Usually hits in the heat of the summer." Silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Genevieve shifted uncomfortably on the hard wooden seat. "It was an outbreak in the city," she stammered, recovering quickly. "We had traveled to St. Louis." "I see." Marcus let the lie hang in the air, allowing her to feel the weight of his disbelief. He didn't push harder. Out here, pushing a panicked animal only made it bite or jump off a cliff. He would wait. Dusk was settling, painting the snow-capped peaks in shades of bruised purple and violent orange, when the cabin finally came into view. It was a sturdy, low-slung structure built of thick, unpeeled pine logs, chinked with mud and moss. A stone chimney smoked lazily against the twilight. It was isolated, perched on a rocky shelf overlooking a vast, empty valley. To Marcus, it was a fortress. To Genevieve, it clearly looked like the end of the world. He pulled the wagon to a halt and jumped down. He walked around to her side and reached up, wrapping his large hands around her waist. She gasped slightly at the contact, her body tense, but allowed him to lift her down. She was shockingly light, like a bird with hollow bones. "Welcome home," Marcus said, the words tasting strange on his tongue. He pushed open the heavy oak door. The inside of the cabin was warm, the coals in the hearth still glowing. It was purely functional, a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, a cast-iron stove, shelves lined with canned goods and dried meat, and a single bed in the corner covered in thick pelts. The walls were decorated with steel traps, snowshoes, and a Henry repeating rifle. Genevieve stepped inside, the buffalo coat trailing on the floor behind her. She looked around, her eyes widening at the single bed. Marcus saw the panic flash in her eyes again. "I'll sleep on the floor near the hearth," Marcus said gruffly, preempting her fear. "I ain't an animal, Genevieve, and I don't force myself on women, especially ones who lied to get here." She whipped around to face him, her cheeks flushing with a mixture of shame and indignation. "I am not a liar, Mr. Boone. Your hands have never seen a day of labor. Your dress costs more than this cabin. You jumped at the sight of my shadow. And you've got a ring mark on your left hand," Marcus listed, walking past her to stoke the fire. "You're running from something or someone. I don't rightly care which. But don't insult my intelligence by playing the grieving farm girl's sister." Genevieve stood frozen in the center of the room. Slowly, she let the heavy buffalo coat slide off her shoulders, falling to the floor in a heap. Without the coat, she looked impossibly small in the rustic cabin. "If you know I am lying, why did you bring me up here?" she asked, her voice trembling, stripping away the cultured facade for just a moment. Marcus turned to look at her, the firelight casting harsh shadows across his scarred face. "Because whoever it is you're running from, they ain't going to look for you at 10,000 feet in a blizzard. You're safe here, for now. But tomorrow, you start earning your keep. This ain't a hotel." The first week was a disaster of magnificent proportions. Genevieve, as Marcus quickly discovered, possessed exactly 0 of the skills required to survive in the wilderness. On her first morning, she attempted to brew coffee, resulting in a blackened, smoking pot of water and grounds that tasted like ash. When tasked with plucking a ptarmigan Marcus had shot, she spent an hour staring at the dead bird in horror before attempting the job. ending up covered in white feathers and crying silent, frustrated tears. Yet, to Marcus's surprise, she never quit. She didn't retreat to the bed to sulk. She wiped her eyes, asked him to show her how to hold the knife properly, and tried again. Her soft hands quickly became blistered and raw from carrying firewood and hauling water from the half-frozen creek. Marcus watched her transform from a terrified society girl into a stubborn, gritted-teeth survivor. She traded her ruined silk dress for a pair of his old canvas trousers, rolled up at the cuffs, and a thick flannel shirt that swallowed her frame. Despite the physical toll, the mountain air seemed to bring a color to her cheeks she hadn't possessed in town. In the quiet evenings, by the light of the oil lamp, she would mend his torn clothes with stitches so fine and intricate they looked like artwork. A strange, fragile domesticity settled over the cabin. They spoke little, but the silence between them shifted from hostile to companionable. Marcus found himself looking forward to returning from checking his trap lines just to see the glow of the cabin window and smell the slightly burned but improving stews she cooked. But the mystery of her past hung over them like an impending avalanche. The break came on a Tuesday. The sky had turned a flat, bruised gray, and the wind was howling with the unmistakable pitch of a major blizzard. Marcus was outside, chopping an extra cord of wood to see them through the storm, when he accidentally sliced his palm on a splintered log. Bleeding heavily, he kicked open the cabin door. "Genevieve, need a bandage." Top shelf. Left side. Genevieve was kneading dough at the table. Seeing the blood, she went pale, but immediately moved to the shelf. I can't reach it," she said, standing on her tiptoes. "Look in my satchel by the bed." "There's some clean rags," Marcus instructed, wrapping a handkerchief around his bleeding hand. Genevieve hurried to the satchel. As she pulled out the clean cotton rags, her own leather valise, tucked beneath the bed, was knocked over. The brass latch gave way, spilling its contents onto the braided rug. Marcus walked over to grab the rags from her. As he looked down, his eyes locked onto the items scattered across the floor. There was no practical clothing. Instead, there was a velvet jewelry box, popped open to reveal a diamond necklace that caught the firelight. There were several stacks of heavy gold double eagles, and resting on top of a silk nightgown was a folded newspaper clipping. Marcus reached down with his good hand and picked up the clipping before Genevieve could scramble to hide it. The paper was high quality, the print thick and black. The masthead read, "The Chicago Tribune." The headline screamed, "Heiress Genevieve Vanderbilt missing. Ruthless railroad baron Nathaniel Croft offers $5,000 land reward for return of his fiancée." Below the headline was a remarkably accurate sketch of the woman currently standing in front of him, clutching a bloody rag. The silence in the cabin was deafening, broken only by the shriek of the blizzard hitting the cabin walls outside. Marcus read the article slowly, his jaw tightening. According to the text, Genevieve had been kidnapped by outlaws on the eve of her wedding to Nathaniel Croft, a man notorious for his violent, monopolistic business tactics and immense wealth. Marcus lowered the paper. He looked at Genevieve. She had backed away, her spine pressed against the rough log wall of the cabin. She looked exactly as she had the day she stepped off the stagecoach, like a trapped animal. "Genevieve Vanderbilt," Marcus said, the name sounding absurd in the rustic cabin. $5,000. That's a sum a man could kill for, or die for. "He didn't want to marry me," she blurted out, her voice cracking. The dam had finally broken. The poised, controlled woman vanished, leaving behind a terrified girl. "He wanted my family's railroad shares. My father died 3 months ago under questionable circumstances. Nathaniel swooped in. He isolated me, kept me locked in our estate. The wedding was going to be a legal transfer of power. And once he had the shares, I knew I would have an accident just like my father." Marcus stared at her, absorbing the gravity of her words. He knew the name Nathaniel Croft. The man had run a spur of his railroad through the foothills near Denver 2 years ago. He had hired Pinkerton thugs to burn out the homesteaders who refused to sell their land. Croft wasn't a businessman. He was a warlord in a tailored suit. "How did you get the Stagecoach ticket?" Marcus asked, his voice low, steadying. "My maid," Genevieve whispered, tears finally spilling over her lashes. Her name was Martha Higgins. She was from Missouri. She had answered your advertisement. She knew I was going to die if I stayed. She gave me her ticket, her identity, and her blessing. She smuggled me out in a laundry cart the night before the wedding." Marcus looked down at the gold coins on the floor. "And the money stolen from his private safe?" she said, lifting her chin with a sudden, fierce spark of defiance. "I took what I needed to survive. I didn't know where the stagecoach was taking me. I just knew it was far away." Marcus tossed the newspaper clipping onto the table. He wrapped his bleeding hand tightly in the rag. The wind hammered against the roof, rattling the heavy timber. "You brought a $5,000 bounty to my doorstep," Marcus stated factually. "Croft won't stop looking. A man like that doesn't let an insult or railroad shares slip away. He'll hire trackers, men who know these mountains." Genevieve closed her eyes, a look of profound defeat washing over her face. "I know. I'm sorry, Mr. Boone. I had no right to drag you into this. As soon as the storm breaks, I will pack my things. I'll walk back down the mountain. You won't be involved." She pushed off the wall and knelt on the floor, her raw, blistered hands shaking as she began gathering the gold coins and the velvet box. Marcus watched her for a long moment. He saw the blister on her thumb, the soot smudged on her forehead, the way the oversized flannel shirt hung on her fragile frame. He thought of the quiet domesticity of the past week, the way the cabin felt less like a tomb and more like a home since she arrived. He stepped forward, his heavy boot pinning the strap of her valise to the floor. Genevieve froze, looking up at him with wide, frightened eyes. "Put it away," Marcus commanded gruffly. "But I said, put it away, Genevieve." Marcus reached down, his massive, uninjured hand wrapping gently around her arm, pulling her to her feet. He looked down into her tear-streaked face. "You walk out there in that snow, you'll be dead by morning. And I didn't bring a bride up this mountain just to let her freeze." Genevieve stared at him, her breath hitching. "They will come for me, Marcus. Men with guns." Marcus turned his head, looking toward the far wall where his Henry repeating rifle hung beneath the head of a massive bull elk. He had survived grizzly bears, avalanches, and claim jumpers. He knew the ridges, the hidden caves, and the deadly drops of Gray's Peak better than any man alive. He looked back at her, his pale blue eyes cold and hard as glacial ice. "Let them come," the mountain man rumbled. "They'll find out the hard way that this mountain belongs to me, and so does the woman under my roof." The blizzard raged for 3 days and 3 nights, sealing the cabin in a tomb of white. Inside, the atmosphere had shifted irrevocably. The unspoken tension between a lonely mountain man and a terrified runaway had forged into something much harder, much more dangerous, an alliance. Marcus spent the long hours of the storm stripping, cleaning, and oiling his arsenal by the heat of the cast-iron stove. He laid out a Henry repeating rifle, an old but reliable Sharps buffalo rifle, and a pair of Colt single-action Army revolvers. The heavy scent of Hop's No. 9 gun oil masked the lingering smell of Genevieve's burnt biscuits. Genevieve sat at the rough-hewn table, her emerald silk dress now cut up and repurposed into cleaning rags, She watched Marcus's large, scarred hands move with mechanical precision over the steel mechanisms. The reality of her situation had settled deep into her bones. She was no longer a Vanderbilt heiress sitting in a gilded Chicago parlor. She was prey. "Nathaniel won't send the local law," Genevieve said quietly, breaking the crackling silence of the fire. "He owns Judge Heiress Caldwell down in Denver. Caldwell will sign whatever warrants Nathaniel puts in front of him. But Nathaniel prefers his own men. It keeps his hands clean." Marcus slotted the cylinder back into a Colt and spun it, the clicks loud and sharp. Who does he use? A man named Caleb Shaw. They call him Deacon. Genevieve shivered, pulling the oversized flannel shirt tighter around her frame. He used to be a jayhawker back in Kansas during the war. Now, he's a private detective in name, but an assassin in practice. He handles Nathaniel's evictions. When the homesteaders along the Clear Creek line wouldn't sell, Deacon Shaw was the one who burned them out. Marcus nodded slowly. He knew the type. Men who had learned to kill under the banner of a uniform and never found a reason to stop once the war ended. Shaw will bring trackers, Ute scouts, maybe, or hard cases from Georgetown who know the high passes. "Can we run?" she asked, her voice tight. "Over the mountains to California?" "Not in this weather," Marcus replied, standing up and grabbing the Henry repeater. He walked over to her, his towering frame casting a long shadow. He held the rifle out horizontally. "Stand up, Genevieve." She stood, her eyes darting from his face to the dark oiled wood of the rifle stock. "Take it," he commanded gently. She reached out, her blistered hands wrapping around the cold steel barrel and the polished wood. It was heavier than she expected, and it pulled her arms down slightly. "Nathaniel Croft thinks you're a porcelain doll he can put back on a shelf," Marcus murmured, stepping behind her. He placed his large hands over hers, guiding the rifle up to her shoulder. "He thinks you're helpless, without his money, or your father's name. You're going to prove him wrong." He adjusted her stance, his chest pressing lightly against her back. The proximity sent a sudden, unexpected jolt through Genevieve. Beneath the rough canvas and wool, Marcus felt like solid granite, a completely immovable force. He smelled of pine sap, wood smoke, and cold, clean air. "Pull the stock tight into the meat of your shoulder," Marcus instructed, his breath warm against her ear. "Otherwise, the recoil will break your collarbone. Sight down the barrel. See that notch? Line it up with the brass bead on the end." Genevieve focused, her breathing shallow. She closed one eye and aligned the sights with a notch in the pine logs of the far wall. "Keep both eyes open," he corrected softly. "Out here, closing an eye means losing half your peripheral vision. You need to see the wolf sneaking up beside you while you aim at the one in front." For 2 hours, Marcus drilled her on the mechanics of the Henry. How to load the tubular magazine. How to rack the lever action smoothly without jamming the brass cartridges, and how to control her breathing. He didn't offer her platitudes or false comfort. He treated her like a partner who needed to pull her weight if they were going to survive the winter. And in doing so, he gave her the one thing Nathaniel Croft had constantly stripped away: respect. On the 4th morning, the storm broke. The sky dawned a brilliant, blinding blue, and the temperature hovered near 0. The world outside was buried under 4 feet of pristine, untouched powder. Marcus strapped on his snowshoes, slung the Sharps rifle over his shoulder, and tied a white canvas tarp around his shoulders for camouflage. "I'm going to scout the ridge," Marcus told her, pausing at the door. "Keep the door barred. Keep the stove damped low so the smoke doesn't give away your position. If you hear someone on the porch and it ain't me whistling the Yellow Rose of Texas, you shoot through the heavy oak. Don't wait for them to open it." Genevieve gripped the Henry rifle, her knuckles white. She looked up at him, her hazel eyes fierce and determined. "Come back, Marcus Boone." "I always do," he said, and slipped out into the blinding white. The air was so cold it burned the inside of Marcus's lungs with every breath. He moved silently through the lodgepole pines, a ghost drifting over the deep snowdrifts. He knew this mountain the way a man knows his own hands. He knew which cornices were ready to snap into avalanches, and he knew the blind spots along the switchback trail leading up from Silver Plume. 2 miles down the mountain, near a frozen cascade of ice known as Bridal Veil, Marcus found the tracks. 3 horses post-holing deeply through the snow, led by a man on foot wearing broad bare-paw snowshoes. They were moving slow, exhausted by the altitude and the bitter cold, but they were moving with purpose. Marcus climbed a rocky outcropping, brushing the snow from a granite slab, and peered down through his brass spyglass. 4 men. They had a small, smokeless fire built in the lee of a massive boulder. 3 were rough-looking toughs, wearing heavy canvas dusters and mismatched cold weather gear, hired muscle from the mining camps. But the 4th man stood out. He wore a heavy black broadcloth overcoat and a bowler hat that looked entirely ridiculous in the high Rockies. He was meticulously cleaning a pair of matching Smith & Wesson Schofield revolvers. Caleb Deacon Shaw. Marcus watched as Shaw pulled a silver flask from his coat, took a pull, and handed it to one of the toughs. The wind shifted, carrying the faint, distorted sounds of their voices up the canyon. Marcus strained to listen. "Don't care if she catches her death." Shaw's voice drifted up, thin and reedy. Croft's orders were clear. "We bring her back breathing if it's easy. If it ain't, we bring back her left hand with the engagement ring on it and toss the rest of her off a cliff." Croft's got a forged will back in Chicago. Grieving fiancé inherits it all. A cold fury, sharp as an icicle, pierced Marcus's chest. This wasn't a retrieval mission. It was a sanctioned hunt. Marcus didn't wait for them to pack up. He leveled the heavy Sharps buffalo rifle, resting the octagonal barrel on a patch of moss. The distance was over 400 yards with a crosswind howling through the canyon. It was a shot few men would take. He breathed in, letting the glacial air fill his lungs, and exhaled slowly. He squeezed the hair trigger. The boom of the .50-90 caliber rifle shattered the mountain silence, echoing like a thunderclap off the granite walls. Down in the camp, the tough holding the silver flask violently jerked backward, thrown into the snowbank as the massive lead slug took him dead in the chest. Chaos erupted. The remaining 2 toughs scrambled for the cover of the boulder, drawing their weapons blindly. But Deacon Shaw didn't panic. He rolled instantly into the deep snow, vanishing from sight into a thicket of scrub oak. Marcus rapidly reloaded the Sharps, his fingers numb but steady. He fired again, a suppressing shot that shattered the rocks just above the toughs' heads, raining granite shrapnel down on them. Up the ridge, one of the men screamed, pointing toward Marcus's position. They began returning fire, their Winchester rifles popping impotently, the bullets falling woefully short or cracking into the trees far below Marcus. But Marcus wasn't looking at them. He was scanning the tree line for the black overcoat. Shaw was gone. Realization hit Marcus like a physical blow. Shaw wasn't going to fight him here. Shaw was a tactician. He realized the sniper had the high ground and the superior weapon. Shaw was flanking him, leaving his hired muscle as bait, making a straight, undetected line for the cabin. Marcus cursed violently, abandoning his hidden perch. He grabbed his snowshoes and began a frantic, lung-burning sprint back up the mountain. Back at the cabin, Genevieve jumped, as the distant muffled boom of the buffalo rifle echoed through the valley. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She gripped the Henry rifle tightly, pacing the small confines of the room. Marcus had told her to wait, to stay hidden. An hour passed. The silence returned, heavy and oppressive. Then she heard it. It wasn't a whistle. It was the faint, unmistakable crunch of snow under a heavy boot on the front porch. Genevieve froze, her breath catching in her throat. She stared at the heavy oak door. She remembered Marcus's words. Don't wait for them to open it. She backed away until her shoulders hit the stone of the chimney. She raised the Henry rifle, her hands trembling violently. She forced herself to remember the cold, steady weight of Marcus standing behind her. Pull the stock tight. Keep both eyes open. The brass latch on the door rattled. A boot kicked against the bottom timber, testing its strength. "Come on out, little bird," a reedy, cold voice called from the other side of the door. "Mr. Croft wants his ring back." Genevieve squeezed her eyes shut for a fraction of a second, gathered every ounce of terror and rage she possessed, and pulled the trigger. The Henry roared, kicking viciously into her shoulder. The .44 caliber bullet punched a clean hole right through the center of the oak door. A sharp cry of pain echoed from the porch, followed by the sound of a heavy body stumbling backward off the wooden planks and into the snow. Genevieve didn't stop. She racked the lever action, ejecting the smoking brass casing, and fired again and again, blindly tracking the sound of the movement outside until the hammer clicked on an empty chamber. Silence descended once more, save for the ringing in her ears. Minutes ticked by like hours. Finally, a shadow fell across the frosted window. Genevieve scrambled for the Colt revolver on the table, her hands slick with sweat. Then, a low, melodic whistle drifted through the logs. The yellow rose of Texas. Genevieve dropped the revolver and lunged for the door, throwing back the heavy iron bar. Marcus stood on the porch, chest heaving, his canvas coat covered in snow. At the bottom of the porch stairs, bleeding heavily from a shattered shoulder, lay Deacon Shaw, groaning in the red-stained snow. Marcus stepped inside, his eyes locking onto Genevieve. He saw the empty rifle in her hands, the bruised shoulder, and the fierce, unyielding fire in her hazel eyes. "You shot him," Marcus breathed, a mixture of shock and profound admiration in his gravelly voice. "I told you," Genevieve said, her voice shaking but her chin held high. "I am not going back." Marcus looked down at the bleeding assassin in the snow, then back to the heiress who had just claimed her own life. The battle for the mountain had begun, and Marcus knew with absolute certainty that there was no line he wouldn't cross to protect the woman standing before him. Marcus hauled Deacon Shaw over the threshold by the collar of his heavy black overcoat, leaving a stark crimson trail across the pristine snow of the porch. The assassin groaned, his right arm hanging uselessly, blood pulsing sluggishly from the ragged exit wound beneath his collarbone. The heavy .44 caliber slug from the Henry rifle had shattered the bone and torn through muscle, but by some miracle of savage luck, it had missed the artery. Marcus dumped Shaw unceremoniously onto the braided rug in the center of the cabin. He kicked the door shut and dropped the heavy iron bar back into place. Genevieve stood frozen near the hearth, the smoking rifle still clutched in her hands. Her face was devoid of color, her eyes wide as she stared at the man bleeding on the floor. It was one thing to know she had fired a weapon. It was another entirely to see the ruin it had caused. "Put the rifle down, Genevieve," Marcus said, his voice calm, a steadying anchor in the turbulent room. "You did exactly what you had to do. He would have killed you without a second thought." She swallowed hard, her throat clicking, and carefully laid the Henry on the table. Her hands were shaking so violently she had to clasp them together to still them. Marcus knelt beside Shaw, drawing his hunting knife. With a few swift, practiced motions, he sliced open the blood-soaked overcoat and the wool suit jacket beneath it. Shaw hissed through his teeth, his pale blue eyes snapping open. They were cold, flat, and entirely devoid of fear. "You've got a hell of a guard dog, Boone," Shaw wheezed, a bloody smile touching his thin lips. He looked past Marcus to Genevieve. "Your intended sends his regards, Miss Vanderbilt. He said to tell you the wedding cake is getting stale." "Shut your mouth," Marcus growled. He grabbed a handful of the ruined emerald silk rags Genevieve had been using for cleaning and pressed them ruthlessly into the wound. Shaw screamed, a raw, ragged sound that bounced off the log walls. "Boil some water," Marcus ordered over his shoulder, "and get the carbolic acid from the top shelf. We need to clean this before he bleeds out or rots from gangrene. I need him talking." Genevieve snapped out of her shock. The sheer pragmatism of the task grounded her. She moved quickly, filling the kettle from the water bucket and stoking the stove. Within minutes, she handed Marcus a steaming basin and a bottle of harsh, stinging antiseptic. Marcus worked with brutal efficiency. He wasn't gentle. He poured the acid directly into the bullet hole, ignoring Shaw's thrashing and swearing, then bound the shoulder tight with strips of clean canvas. When he was finished, he hauled the assassin up and shoved him into one of the heavy oak chairs, tying his good arm and his legs to the wood with thick hemp rope. The adrenaline of the firefight was beginning to ebb, leaving a heavy, exhausted tension in its wake. Outside, the wind howled around the eaves of the cabin, indifferent to the blood and violence within. Marcus pulled up the second chair and sat backward, resting his thick forearms on the backrest, bringing him eye to eye with the captive. "You've got 2 men dead in the snow down by Bridal Veil," Marcus stated, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "The third ran off toward Georgetown like a whipped cur. So, here's how this plays out, Shaw. You tell me exactly what Nathaniel Croft's plan is, and I let you sit by the fire until you heal enough to walk down this mountain a free man. You lie to me, and I drag you back out to the porch and let the timber wolves finish what the rifle started." Shaw let his head fall back against the chair, coughing weakly. "You think you're holding a winning hand, Trapper. You're playing against the bank. Croft ain't sitting in Chicago waiting for a telegraph." Genevieve stepped forward, coming to stand beside Marcus. Her fear had transmuted into a cold, diamond-hard fury. "Where is he, Caleb? Where is Nathaniel?" Shaw's eyes flicked to her, a grudging respect mingling with his malice. "He's in Denver, sweetheart. Rode in on his private rail car 2 days ago. He's got the local sheriff in his pocket, and 20 Pinkerton strikebreakers armed with repeating shotguns and Winchesters. They're loading onto a narrow-gauge train bound for the Georgetown Loop right now." Marcus's jaw tightened. 20 well-armed men. That wasn't a posse. That was a small army. "He's coming himself?" Genevieve asked, her voice faltering slightly. "He wants to watch you hang, Boone," Shaw sneered, spitting a glob of bloody phlegm onto the floor. "And he wants to put the ring on her finger while she watches you swing. You can't fight 20 men, Mountain Man. They'll burn this cabin to the ground and sift through the ashes for her." Marcus didn't blink. He simply stood up, towering over the tied man. "They have to get up the mountain first." He grabbed a soiled rag and stuffed it unceremoniously into Shaw's mouth, tying it off with a piece of twine to silence the man. The silence that followed was heavy, pressing in on them from all sides. Marcus walked over to the wash basin, scrubbing the blood from his hands with harsh lye soap. Genevieve stood by the stove, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. The bravado she had shown a moment ago was crumbling. Marcus dried his hands and turned to her. He saw the violent tremor in her shoulders, the way she was biting her lip to keep from crying out. He crossed the room in 2 long strides and stopped in front of her. "Genevieve," he said softly. She looked up, a tear finally breaking free and tracking through the soot on her cheek. "I brought this to your door. They are going to destroy your home. They are going to kill you, all because I was too weak to fight him in Chicago." "Stop," Marcus commanded, his voice gentle but firm. He reached out, his massive, calloused hands gently gripping her shoulders. He felt her flinch, and he shifted his grip, realizing the rifle recoil had severely bruised her right side. He traced the line of her collarbone over the thick flannel shirt, his touch shockingly tender for a man of his size. "You aren't weak," Marcus murmured, his pale eyes searching hers. A weak woman would have surrendered to the snow on the first day. A weak woman wouldn't have pulled the trigger on a killer breaking down the door. You fought back. You survived. "But 20 men," she whispered, stepping instinctively closer to him, seeking his warmth. "Let them bring 50, Marcus said, his thumb brushing away the tear on her cheek. The physical contact sent a sudden, profound jolt through both of them. It wasn't the frantic, desperate touch of strangers surviving a storm. It was an acknowledgement of something deeper, something forged in the crucible of the past week. Genevieve leaned into his hand, closing her eyes. For a fleeting moment, the heiress and the mountain man ceased to exist. They were just a man and a woman standing on the edge of the world, finding solace in the storm. "We can't stay here," Marcus said quietly, his forehead resting lightly against hers. "He's right about one thing. A cabin is just a wooden box if they surround it. We need to move." Genevieve opened her eyes, the vulnerability fading back into resolve. "Where do we go?" "Higher," Marcus replied, turning to look out the frosted window toward the jagged peaks. "To a place where numbers don't mean a damn thing." Dawn broke like a cracked mirror, scattering cold, brittle light across the snow-choked valley. The wind had died down, leaving a stillness so profound it felt unnatural. Marcus and Genevieve moved with frantic, coordinated purpose. They packed only the essentials: dried venison, coffee, wool blankets, and every single round of ammunition Marcus possessed. Marcus hauled Deacon Shaw up from the chair. The assassin looked pale and feverish, the gunshot wound taking its toll, but he could walk. Marcus marched him to the heavy reinforced oak door of the root cellar built into the hillside behind the cabin. "You've got a bucket of water, a loaf of hardtack, and 3 heavy pelts in there," Marcus told him, shoving the man into the dark, freezing space. "Your friends will find you eventually. If they don't, you'll freeze in about 3 days. Consider it a fair trade for the men you burned out down in the valley." Marcus slammed the heavy door shut, dropped the iron crossbar, and locked it with a heavy brass padlock. Genevieve was waiting by the buckboard, fully swallowed in Marcus's buffalo coat, the Henry rifle slung across her back. Marcus strapped his snowshoes on, hitched the 2 mules, Samson and Delilah, and led them up the narrow, treacherous trail that switched back behind the cabin. Their destination was the Black Ridge Shaft, an abandoned silver mine 3 miles further up the mountain. It had gone bust 5 years ago when the vein ran dry, but Marcus knew its layout intimately. The mine sat at the end of a sheer box canyon, accessible only by a single narrow ridge trail flanked by a deadly drop into a gorge. It was a natural fortress, a place where 20 men would have to walk single file to approach. The climb was agonizing. The snow was chest-deep in places, and Marcus had to break trail, his massive legs driving through the powder like pistons. Behind him, Genevieve struggled, her breath pluming in the freezing air, her legs burning with lactic acid, but she never complained. Every time Marcus looked back to check on her, she met his gaze, set her jaw, and took another step in his footprints. By noon, the timberline fell away, leaving only jagged, wind-swept granite and ice. The entrance to the Black Ridge shaft loomed ahead, a dark, ragged hole punched into the side of the mountain, shored up by thick, graying timbers. They led the mules deep into the main tunnel, away from the biting wind. The air inside the mine was remarkably warmer, smelling heavily of damp earth, sulfur, and old rust. Marcus dropped his heavy pack and immediately went to work. He walked to the back of the first cavern, prying loose a loose board covering an old supply cache. He pulled out a wooden crate stenciled with the words, Hercules Powder Co. Genevieve walked over, her eyes widening as Marcus lifted the lid. The crate was half full of red, wax paper-wrapped sticks of dynamite nestled in sawdust. Miners left it behind when the company went bankrupt, Marcus explained, carefully lifting a stick. The nitroglycerin hadn't crystallized too badly, but it was old, making it volatile. Out here, explosive power is better than a lock on a door. He pulled out a spool of canvas-wrapped fuse cord and a box of blasting caps. He handed 3 sticks of dynamite and a length of fuse to Genevieve. "I need you to learn this right now," he said, his tone dead serious. "You insert the cap into the top. You push the fuse in. When you light it, this length will give you exactly 7 seconds. You count to 3, and you throw it as hard as you can down the shaft. Do you understand?" Genevieve stared at the explosive, her heart hammering. She was an heiress. 2 weeks ago, her biggest concern was whether the florist had sourced the correct shade of white roses for the wedding reception. Now, she was holding enough explosive power to level a city block. She looked up at Marcus. "I understand." "Good." Marcus grabbed an armful of the explosives. "I'm going to rig the choke point on the ridge trail. You stay here. Keep the fire small. Keep the mules quiet." Marcus moved back toward the entrance of the mine. He crawled out onto the narrow, icy ridge overlooking the valley. The view was breathtakingly vast, a sea of white peaks rolling endlessly into the horizon. But Marcus wasn't looking at the scenery. He was looking down the mountain toward the shelf where his cabin sat. A thick, oily column of black smoke was rising into the crystal-clear sky. They had arrived. Croft's men had found the empty cabin, and in their frustration, they had set it ablaze. Marcus watched the smoke for a long minute. That cabin was 12 years of his life. It was every piece of wood he had chopped, every log he had chinked, every winter he had survived alone. Now, it was just ash. A heavy, murderous calm settled over him. He systematically began wedging sticks of dynamite into the deep fissures of the granite wall overhanging the narrow trail, linking them with one long, continuous fuse. When he returned to the cave, Genevieve saw the look in his eyes. She smelled the faint, distant scent of burning pine on the wind. She rushed forward, grabbing his arm. "Marcus, the cabin gone," he said flatly, setting his rifles on a crate. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice cracking with guilt. "Everything you built, everything you owned." Marcus stopped moving. He turned to her, the dim light of the cave throwing harsh shadows across his scarred face. He reached out, his hand cupping her cheek, his thumb tracing her jawline. "A man can rebuild a house," Marcus said softly, the gravel in his voice entirely smoothed out. "Wood is cheap. What matters is standing right in front of me." Genevieve's breath hitched. Before she could overthink it, before the terror of the impending battle could paralyze her, she leaned up and pressed her lips to his. It was a desperate, urgent kiss, tasting of cold wind and fear, but anchored by a profound, undeniable fire. Marcus's arms wrapped tightly around her waist, pulling her flush against his chest, holding her as if she were the only solid thing left in the world. For a minute, the cold, the mine, and the army marching up the mountain ceased to matter. A sharp, distant crack shattered the silence. Marcus broke the kiss instantly, spinning toward the mouth of the cave, the Sharp's buffalo rifle already in his hands. Gunfire, Marcus muttered, his eyes narrowing into the blinding white glare outside. Genevieve grabbed the Henry repeater, racking the lever action, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "They found the tracks," Marcus said, moving to the edge of the rock wall, looking down the switchbacks. Through the spyglass, he could see them. A dark, serpentine line of men trudging up the pristine white slopes, heavily armed and moving with grim determination. And riding a massive black stallion in the center of the column, wearing a heavy fur-lined coat that looked untouched by the elements, was Nathaniel Croft. The ruthless baron had come to reclaim his property. "Get back in the shadows, Genevieve," Marcus ordered, thumbing the hammer back on the massive 50-90 rifle. He struck a match against the rock face, holding the flickering flame inches from the long fuse cord sneaking out to the cliff face. "It's time to teach Mr. Croft who really owns this mountain." The hiss of the lit fuse was a serpent's whisper against the howling high-altitude wind. Marcus watched the spark eat its way down the canvas-wrapped cord, disappearing into the jagged fissures of the granite wall overhanging the narrow ridge trail. 100 yards below, Nathaniel Croft's private army marched in a tight, disciplined column. They were seasoned Pinkerton men and hardened Colorado strikebreakers, their breath pluming in the freezing air like smoke from a locomotive. At the center of the formation, Croft sat atop his black stallion, draped in a magnificent silver fox coat. He looked less like a man coming to reclaim a stolen bride, and more like a monarch surveying a conquered territory. "Get back, Genevieve, deep into the shaft," Marcus ordered, his voice echoing off the damp rock walls. Genevieve retreated behind a stack of rotting timber, clutching the Henry rifle to her chest, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She watched Marcus shoulder the heavy Sharp's buffalo rifle, his massive frame perfectly still, a predator waiting for the trap to snap shut. The lead Pinkertons reached the choke point. They paused, their boots slipping on the treacherous, ice-slicked rock. One of them looked up, noticing the unnatural fresh cracks in the granite, just as the fuse met the blasting caps. The explosion tore the sky apart. A deafening, concussive roar ripped through the canyon, sending a shock wave that rattled Genevieve's teeth and showered the interior of the mine with decades-old dust. The granite face above the trail shattered outward in a spectacular eruption of fire, smoke, and jagged stone. Thousands of pounds of rock sheared away from the mountain, crashing down onto the trail and obliterating the front of the column. Men and horses screamed as the ground vanished beneath them, swept into the deadly gorge below by the localized avalanche of stone and ice. When the smoke cleared, the narrow trail was gone, replaced by a gaping, impassable chasm. Marcus racked the lever of the Sharps, a grim satisfaction settling into his scarred features. The path to the Black Ridge shaft was severed, but Nathaniel Croft had not built a railroad empire by retreating from broken bridges. Down on the lower switchback, Croft fought to control his panicked stallion. He didn't look at the men he had just lost. He looked straight up at the smoking mouth of the mine, his face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. "Dismount," Croft bellowed, his voice carrying over the wind. "Leave the horses. Bring up the sleds. If we can't walk across, we'll blow the rest of this godforsaken rock into the valley." Marcus peered through his brass spyglass, his blood running suddenly cold. From the rear of the surviving column, men were dragging heavy wooden sledges up the snow-choked incline. Strapped to the sleds were the disassembled parts of a Hotchkiss mountain gun, a rapid-fire, lightweight artillery piece designed specifically for high-altitude warfare. "They brought a cannon," Marcus muttered, lowering the glass. He turned to Genevieve, his pale blue eyes deadly serious. "Croft ain't trying to capture you anymore, Genevieve. He's trying to bury us." The Pinkertons moved with terrifying efficiency, assembling the Hotchkiss gun on a flat outcropping of rock across the gorge. Marcus didn't wait for them to finish. He braced the heavy octagonal barrel of the Sharps against the cavern wall, sighted down the long iron tube, and squeezed the hair trigger. The .50-90 caliber slug crossed the chasm in a fraction of a second, taking the lead gunner squarely in the chest and throwing him backward into the snow. Marcus reloaded frantically, the brass casings clinking musically against the stone floor. He fired again, shattering the wooden wheel of the artillery mount, but there were too many of them. Another man stepped up, ignoring the blood of his comrade, and slammed a high-explosive shell into the breech of the Hotchkiss. "Cover!" Marcus roared, diving away from the entrance and tackling Genevieve to the floor just as the canyon lit up with a blinding flash. The artillery shells struck the heavy timber shoring at the mouth of the cave. The explosion was deafening, a catastrophic blast of concussive force and splintering wood. The roof of the cavern groaned violently, raining heavy debris down upon them. A massive, jagged beam of oak snapped and collapsed, crashing down across Marcus's left leg with a sickening crunch of bone. Marcus let out a raw, guttural shout of agony, his vision swimming with black spots. Dust choked the air, thick and suffocating. Genevieve scrambled out from under the shower of dirt and pebbles, coughing violently. "Marcus!" She crawled to his side, her hands frantically tearing at the heavy oak beam pinning him to the floor. It was completely immovable. Marcus gripped her wrists, his face pale beneath the grime, sweat beading on his forehead despite the freezing cold. I can't move it," she sobbed, panic finally clawing its way up her throat. "Listen to me," Marcus rasped, forcing the pain down. He reached out, pressing a bloodied hand against her cheek. "They're going to bridge the gap with the sledges. They'll be inside in 3 minutes. You have to take the back tunnel. It leads to a ventilation shaft. You can climb out to the upper ridge." "I'm not leaving you here," Genevieve screamed, her eyes blazing with a fierce, wild defiance. "You can't fight a dozen men with an empty rifle, Genevieve. Run." But Genevieve didn't look at the jammed Henry rifle lying in the dirt. She looked at the wooden crate stenciled with Hercules Powder Co., sitting near the back wall. "No," she said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm whisper. "I'm done running." The crunch of heavy boots on broken rock echoed through the lingering smoke. Genevieve stood up, dusting the dirt from Marcus's oversized buffalo coat. She walked over to the wooden crate and calmly picked up 3 sticks of red, wax paper-wrapped dynamite, tightly bound together with twine. The short 7-second fuse Marcus had prepared earlier dangled from the blasting cap. She walked to the mouth of the cavern and stepped out into the freezing light. Across the ruined gap, Croft's men had laid the heavy wooden sledges over the chasm, creating a makeshift bridge. 5 Pinkertons were already halfway across, their Winchesters raised, but it was the man stepping off the bridge onto the ledge of the mine that made Genevieve's blood freeze. Nathaniel Croft stood 10 feet away, a pristine Colt revolver in his gloved hand. His expensive silver fox coat was dusted with rock powder, but his hair was perfectly slicked back. He looked at her, his lips curling into a cruel, triumphant smile. "Look at you," Croft sneered, his dark eyes raking over her dirty face, the oversized flannel shirt, and the men's trousers. "You look like a feral dog, Genevieve. I warned your father this would happen if he let you read too many books. You forgot your place." Genevieve didn't flinch. She felt the heavy weight of the dynamite in her left hand and the small brass match safe she had slipped from Marcus's pocket in her right. "My father didn't fall from that balcony, did he, Nathaniel?" Genevieve asked, her voice ringing clear and steady over the whistling wind. Croft chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. He took a step closer, raising the revolver and pointing it directly at her chest. "He was a stubborn old fool who refused to understand the future. The railroads demand consolidation, my dear. He was an obstacle, just like that filthy animal bleeding out in the cave behind you." "He is twice the man you will ever be," Genevieve said fiercely. "And yet, he's going to die in the dirt, and you are coming back to Chicago." Croft replied, cocking the hammer of the Colt. "Drop the explosives, Genevieve. You don't have the stomach for it. You never did. You're a Vanderbilt. You were bred for drawing rooms, not battlefields." Genevieve looked at the man who had murdered her father, who had terrorized a mountain, and who had tried to extinguish the only real warmth she had ever known. She thought of Marcus, lying in the dark, willing to die to give her a chance to run. She looked up at the fractured, unstable roof of the cavern entrance directly above Croft's head, heavily damaged by his own artillery shell. "You're right, Nathaniel," Genevieve said softly, a deadly calm washing over her. "I'm not a murderer, but I am a survivor." With a swift, practiced motion, she struck a sulfur match against the brass safe. It flared to life, bright and hot. Before Croft could react, she touched the flame to the canvas fuse. It hissed violently, sparks showering the snow. Croft's eyes widened in sudden, absolute terror. He realized in a fraction of a second that she wasn't going to throw it at him. She was going to bring the entire mountain down. "Shoot her!" Croft screamed, backpedaling toward the makeshift bridge. But Genevieve had already thrown the bundle. She hurled it upward with all her might, wedging the dynamite perfectly into the massive splintered crack in the cavern ceiling. She spun around and sprinted back into the dark depths of the mine, diving behind the stacked timbers just as Marcus had done. "1," she whispered. 2, 3. The blast was apocalyptic. The dynamite detonated inside the structural weakness of the cavern roof. Thousands of tons of unstable granite, loosened by the artillery fire, gave way completely. The entire face of the mountain sheer collapsed in a thunderous, earth-shattering roar. Genevieve covered her ears, pressing her face into the dirt as the shockwave rolled over her, followed by a terrifying darkness as the entrance to the mine was completely sealed off by falling rock. The screams of Nathaniel Croft and his men were instantly silenced, swallowed whole by the crushing weight of the mountain as they were swept off the ledge and buried under 50 ft of stone and snow in the gorge below. Then there was only the sound of falling dust and ringing silence. Genevieve lay in the pitch black for a long moment, struggling to breathe through the thick air. She coughed, blindly reaching out into the dark. "Marcus?" she croaked, panic seizing her chest. "Marcus!" A weak, gravelly cough answered her from the darkness. "Over here!" Genevieve scrambled over the rubble, her hands finding the heavy canvas of his coat. She wept openly, her tears mixing with the rock dust on his face. She felt his hands weakly wrap around her waist, pulling her close. "You brought the roof down," Marcus breathed, his voice a mixture of awe and exhaustion. "I told you," Genevieve whispered, resting her forehead against his chest, listening to the steady, reassuring beat of his heart. "I'm not going back." The legend of the Silver Plume heiress would echo through the saloons and assay offices of Colorado for decades. When the spring thaw finally came, deputy marshals dispatched by Governor Frederick Walker Pitkin arrived at the Black Ridge Gorge. They found the crushed remains of Nathaniel Croft's private army and the shattered Hotchkiss gun, ruling it a tragic avalanche. No one ever found Genevieve Vanderbilt or the $5,000 in stolen gold. Instead, high above the timberline, overlooking a valley of unbroken wildflowers, a new cabin was built. It was stronger than the last, with a deep root cellar and a porch wide enough to watch the sunset. Marcus Boone's leg healed with a permanent limp, a small price to pay for the woman who stood by his side, her hands calloused, but her spirit entirely unbroken. They were married by a traveling circuit judge the following summer, not with a diamond ring, but with a simple band of hammered mountain silver. The heiress had died in the snow, but the woman she became lived forever in the high, untamed country.
Hi, my name is William Sunny, the owner and manager of Iron Cowboy Gardena. After watching the video, That Can't Be My Bride, the mountain man stared as a stunning woman stepped off the stagecoach. I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What I liked most about this story was how quickly first impressions started to fall apart once the characters really began to see each other. At first, everything seemed built around surprise and expectations, but underneath that was a story about trust, vulnerability, and learning who someone truly is beyond appearances. Those quieter moments ended up meaning more than the dramatic ones to me. Do you think the mountain man was more surprised by her beauty or by the kind of person she turned out to be? And was there a moment where your opinion about either character changed during the story? I think stories like this remind us that people are usually more complicated and more human than the labels or assumptions placed on them. If this story meant something to you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy these mountain stories about unexpected connection, resilience, and second chances, feel free to stay connected with Iron Cowboy Gardena.